Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Farmers Weekly's Business Clinic Succession webinar. I'm Susie Horn, Farmers Weekly's business editor. I grew up on farms in East and North Yorkshire, where my brothers are arable and sheep farmers. Thank you very much to everyone for joining the webinar and for our panel and their expertise tonight. We're going to discuss succession in farming, and we've had a lot of interest in this session, lots of advanced questions. So we'll get straight to it. I'll introduce our panel. They're each going to speak just for a few minutes about to introduce themselves a bit more and to talk about the work that they do in farming succession. And then we will go to our questions after the short presentations. All of the participants in tonight's webinar are members of the firms that sponsor Farmers Weekly's Business Clinic pages. So first of all, we have Joe Spencer, who's a partner at Accountant MHA. Then Sam Doherty, also a partner this time at law firm Thrings, where she's a member of the private client team. And then we have Mark Charter, a partner in Carter Jonas. Mark's head of the firm's real estate management department. So after they've all spoken, we'll open things up for discussion, tackle some of the questions that we've had in, and along with those that come in during the session. If you want to ask a question, there should be a box at the bottom of your screen where you can type your questions in. They'll come into a list that I can see, and then I can direct them to the panel. You can ask a question at any time, and then we'll just get to it. We'll get to as many as we can, but we have had a lot already. Do make use of the experts that we've got here tonight, and we will be on for about an hour and a quarter. And then afterwards, if you've registered for the webinar, it will be available to watch on demand, and you should get an email to let you know when that's ready. So we'll go first of all to Joe to tell us a bit more about the work, about himself, the work that he does for farmers in helping them arrange succession. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Susie, and good evening all. Yeah, my name's Joe Spencer, so I'm a partner at MHA, formerly McIntyre Hudson, accountant and tax advisor. I've been working in the sector for all of my career, so 20 years now, and have, really enjoy it and all the variety it brings. My notes this evening, in doing a bit of an intro on succession planning. Top note was thorny subject. It's one of them items that perhaps a lot of people don't want to talk about, but it's a really key strategic planning point that needs to be, it needs to be considered. Strategic thinking for a business, and that's what it is. You've got to remember this. Whilst it might be part of the lifestyle, whilst the farm might be part of lifestyle and farm life, there is an underlying business there, and you do need to think strategically in order to succeed. My experience is mainly as an accountant and a trusted advisor to these to my clients, and I'm often asked about what is best to do in situations when it comes to succession planning. And often, the answer is very complex, and that's mainly due to the circumstances that surround the situation. Every situation is different, every family is different, and there is no silver bullet. And I think that's a really important thing to understand as you progress through the succession planning and try and tackle that subject. All different outcomes, and everyone is different. We are dealing with people here, so you have to take a different approach to different people, and that may mean you have to, get other people involved, or consider different options of how you tackle certain subjects. And people react differently. I think that's one of the main experiences I've seen. I've been in kitchens, or not necessarily boardrooms, tend to be around the kitchen table as you might expect, or where the family get to meet to discuss their farming issues. And I've had people shouting at each other, I've had people crying, I've had so I've got a wide experience. That's not every single time that happens, but sometimes that does happen, and you have to try and navigate that situation. And I'd say that's because it's such an emotional subject for people. You're talking about someone's life. People get upset. Sometimes you need to sanction off and have a separate meeting with one person to try and get them to calm down, or get them to see the other angle, but it's a very tricky subject to approach. In terms of challenges, I think from a business succession point of view, one of the things that is most underestimated is the time it can take to go through a business succession planning procedure, or actually, just starting it off and getting it going. That's seriously underestimated, and the amount of emotions involved as well. The emotions for the oldest generation may be very different to the oldest to the younger, to those emotions of the youngest generation. So that's always something to consider. And we've also got those people who may have their head in the sand. That they are some of the challenges that you face. Some people just do not want to be engaged in this subject. So that's another big challenge. The loudest room in the voice isn't always right. The loudest voice in the room isn't always right, should I say, sorry. And there's a fear of loss of control. So it's a subject that's not always natural, and it's not an everyday occurrence. So my top recommendations, just as to kick this off, is keep things transparent. That's what I've found in my experience is, let's lay all the cards on the table, let's hear all the voices, keep it transparent, and that's a good foundation block to start from. And it's a journey, so taking people on the way with them, take everyone on the way with you. Otherwise, if you don't get the buy-in from the start, then it's going to be a challenging subject as you approach it moving forwards. But that gives a bit of an overview. Susie, so back to you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Joe. That's fine. It's sparked lots of thoughts and questions already. So, we move on to Sam Doherty now to talk about the legal side and what you encounter, Sam.
Yes, I'm Sam. I'm from Thring Solicitors. I'm a partner there in their tax and succession department. We are based in Wye and Severn Valley, so lots of different farming communities around us. And like Joe says, from our perspective, obviously we want farmers to be able to pass on to the next generation in the most tax efficient way that they can, especially given the current climate of diversification and the move away from things that are necessarily agricultural anymore, or count as agricultural, to get agricultural property relief. And I'm going to echo the same as Joe. It's having those open, honest conversations from an early start, basically, when you're looking to pass down to the next generation, when you're getting the next generations involved, having those conversations as to how they're going to be involved, what are the non-negotiables within the farms, to make sure that you don't find yourself in 5 years' time looking at a farm that's completely different to what you expected it to be when you were looking at passing down towards the next generation or diversification. And making sure that these conversations, as Joe said, are open and honest at the beginning. Often we find families where the farm won't support all the generations coming up, and it's making sure that everybody understands what the position is, the different structures that can be put in place to try and make sure that the non-farming family can receive something from the farm, but that won't cripple the farm and stop the farmer being able to farm for generations to come. And all of these conversations are better had as early as possible and as openly as possible, as Joe has said, to try and make sure that you can achieve the outcome that you want at the end of it. And as Joe said, difficult conversations, but far better to have now rather than what we quite often get is at the end of an estate, trying to sort it out and get everybody pleased with the outcome, which is very unlikely and potentially going to cause litigation instead.
Okay, thanks very much, Sam. And we'll move now to Mark Charter from Carter Jonas. Mark.
Thanks, Susie. My name's Mark Charter, and as Susie indicated, I'm a partner at Carter Jonas, running their sort of estate management work across the country, although personally I'm based in Oxford and generally work across southern England. I think the common theme you will hear from all three of us, and it'll probably crop up in the questions as well, is communication, and communication across the generations ahead of time. And that's really been at the crux of our experiences here in terms of working with, either our estate clients or farming clients. The key to a successful succession and successful family harmony is that communication across the generations. And that's where the sort of conversations are are had ahead of time in a non-confrontational manner, and that's, you know, in terms of our role, quite often is at the more practical end of those conversations, where we can take that sort of role of honest broker, as Joe indicated, quite often sat around the kitchen table in terms of just fostering that discussion as what is going to happen in the future. It's also, I think, the other area where things go awry is where, again, it's not discussed what is in the family or in the parents' generation's will, which then leads to surprises, particularly where you've got siblings, some of whom are involved in the farming operation and some of whom are not, and you then have an unequal division of asset. That sort of discussion not being held ahead of time is generally what leads to ill will amongst the sort of the future sort of younger generations in family operations. So I think, yeah, Susie, it's all about communication, and it's all about early, honest, open, transparent communication, where one of that team of professional advisors is able to take the role of honest broker, and that's generally been the experience I've had in my career of where it's been successful. That's how it's tended to work.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you, Susie.
Right, thank you. Thank you, all of you. I mean, a few things that you mentioned between you there. Obviously, communication, and somebody talked about non-negotiables, and I think sometimes perhaps you encounter situations where it seems like a non-negotiable, and somebody's got their heels properly dug in, and then, you know, when there are so many options for sorting things out, perhaps those non-negotiables sometimes become negotiable, do they?
I mean, from the perspective of non-negotiables, it's really when you're bringing in the next generation into the farm or you're diversifying, everybody should really sit down and say,
we've lost you, Sam. Right, I think we might have to go to someone else just while we get Sam sorted out on the technical side. Joe, can we move?
Yeah, sure. I'll just pick that up. So, yeah, I think it's I think what Sam was going to say there was it's a case of bringing all them issues to the table at the start and making that really clear. You know, so something that could be a non-negotiable at the start, at the outset, once all the cards are laid on the table, and, you know, you've gone through the processes of what are, you know, this is scenario planning essentially. This is what you end up doing is scenario planning. So once all the scenarios have been planned through and you've seen what the outcomes could be on the other side, it may be that non-negotiable at the start has changed into a negotiable item. And Sam's back now, so you might want to finish.
Yeah, we'll just move to Joe because we lost you briefly, Sam.
Carry on, it's fine. Yeah, it was basically that. But if there is something that everybody, this is what the farm is, this is the heart of the farm, and if this changes, I'm going to be really unhappy, that's going to have to be on the table at the beginning so that everybody can understand where they can move to and what the farm is going to look like at the end of any generation swap or diversification, to make sure that everybody is as happy as they can be at the end outcome.
Right, thank you. Mark, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think it's important in terms of the non-negotiables that, you know, at times everybody's going to need to find areas of compromise and where they can find that common ground, and whilst you might want to present a non-negotiable, I think from a negotiating position, what you really don't want to do is back yourself into a corner so that you've got nowhere to go. You know, everybody's going to need to move their position to get to that final outcome, and you know, and failure to do that is what will then create the arguments or the ill will or the tension further down the line.
Yeah. Right, thank you all. We've got a couple of very similar questions, so I'll read them both, but they basically share a lot of elements, and it's the old chestnut of being fair and being equal, and that's not necessarily the same thing. So one is, how do you split up or share out the business to 2 daughters and a younger son? The son's involved and working on the farm. The daughters are interested but have no real input. And another one like that, how to succession plan for siblings. but tailoring a plan for both being involved, also having a plan if only one of them wants to be active on the farm. So it's sort of covering two situations, but similarities. So perhaps we'll go to Mark first on that one.
Thanks, Susie. I think the other common theme, I think, as well as communication, is actually there's probably, to many of these, there's never a right or wrong answer. And the individual circumstances will play into the final outcome. But I think it's not unusual in a farming family where you have a number of siblings and not all of them are involved in the farm. And I think it's quite understandable, and I think most people understand that, if the parents were looking to leave the farm to their children, they might want to leave it in unequal shares to reflect the value and the earning income that one sibling has foregone by working in the farm and the investment he's made. So I think it's not unreasonable to have an outcome where you've got an unequal division. But I would also say probably leaving it all to the one sibling and cutting out a number of the others probably, is not the right kind of outcome either. It's finding some middle ground and then making sure you've explained your situation to all of the siblings so they understand where you are coming from, and making sure it's been a consistent approach and a consistent viewpoint that's been well documented. But within that division, perhaps again reflecting the fact that the one sibling is living and working on the farm, is that the division should perhaps include that sibling's house that he's living in, so that if you are dividing it up, the working farming sibling will end up with the ownership and control of the property he's living in as an outcome, as well as perhaps a share of the land.
Thank you. Sam, I think it was you that mentioned, sorry, I've lost my thread. I'll just come to Sam on this one, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, from our point of view, this is probably the question that we get asked the most, is how do we make it as fair as we can to distribute this between farming and non-farming children.
Sorry, just interrupting, but I remember what my I was going to refer to you saying that not sort of hampering the farming business by making a division. So that was just the point I wanted to
Yeah. So that was one of the points I was going to come on to, is some of the things that do need to be considered when you're thinking of fairness is currently, subject to what happens on the 30th, the next generation who's currently farming normally is the person that will get you your APR. And if they weren't there and they weren't doing that job and they weren't acting as a farmer, you would have potentially lost half this, or 40% of this value to inheritance tax. So that should really be taken into consideration when you're looking at this fairness point, is that you are saving some inheritance tax by this farmer being on the land and farming for you. And also, you don't want to stop them being able to run the farm. So dividing it up, taking some of the land away from the farmer, for example, potentially will stop that farm being viable for them. And it's finding different corporate structures, potentially limited companies, giving the non-farming siblings a different class of share or something like that. There's lots of different structures that you can put in place that will still enable the non-farming siblings to have an interest, but enable the farmer to carry on farming.
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, I completely echo what both Sam and Mark have said there, really. But, viability is a great word, Sam. This is still a business. Ultimately, the idea of the succession is that the business continues in the future. So you can't strip it of all its assets to make things fair and equal. Because you may then be, as a consequence of that, putting undue pressure under the business, and what's the point in going through the succession planning element of it if there's nothing there at the end, if it's not going to work at the end. So that's really important. And what's fair is not always equal, and vice versa. We know that, like you say, that's a very common answer to this question. I think of going back to what Mark said, transparency at the start. Make it really clear what the expectations are for the son. What are his siblings' expectations, and vice versa. So the son can plan accordingly, as in that situation as the business owner going forward. And so there's also a really clear understanding, a clear platform where you can operate from. Sam mentioned about structures. That's definitely something that can be looked at. If it was a company, you may consider giving some smaller shareholdings to the daughters so they can continue to benefit from the success of the business going forwards. Via income or capital, if something should happen in the end. But you also got to consider you may not want to give an overbearing amount of control to the daughters. You want the son to still operate in that scenario. You want the son to still be able to operate, control the business, and run it as a viable business entity. So that all needs to be considered. And you also might want to retain control yourself. If that situation is son and two daughters, they could not get on. They could get on. You don't know. But you may also, as the current owner and person who's looking to implement some succession planning with the younger generation, you may also want to retain an element of control until that is a settled position. And then again, it's having that transparent plan of, right, we are going to take these steps. It might be 10 years before we get there, but we are going to go through these steps. And at this point, the end result will be X or Y.
Yeah. Right. That. Thank you, Joe. That point about retaining some control brings me neatly on to a very brief question, which is, if I pass it on now, what's to stop them kicking me out? Fairly blunt, but it's a question that's been put. So I'm not sure which, probably Sam from a legal perspective, but I'm sure the other two have maybe got something to contribute. Sam?
I mean, if that's a fear, I wouldn't pass it all on now. It's probably my answer to that question.
Yeah.
There's lots of ways you can get the younger generation involved without actually losing all control or passing it all over. And that way you can make sure that the younger generation is up to the job, that they're not going to do something like kick you out, and that you are still going to be able to carry on in the lifestyle that you've been accustomed to while still bringing them through the company or the partnership, whatever it is you have, because you don't necessarily want to give it to an untested child and hope that they can do a really good job on it and bring it through the way you want them to. And it once again is that communication, having the discussions. What works for your farm might not work for a different farm. But I mean, I would never advise giving away your property, for example, and that way you would never be chucked out. They wouldn't be able to kick you out. But yeah, it would be looking at the different structures and how you bring the next generation in. And it isn't always just a straightforward, here you go, it's yours, get on with it, let's see what happens. I don't think any of us would ever advise that.
No. Okay. I don't know if Joe or Mark, if you've got anything to add to that.
I think one thing I've been told over the years is to not let the tax tail wag the dog. So to keep everything in perspective. I think what I've also seen is, previously some clients and families have let that tax tail wag the dog and have given everything away to the next generation. And it's not that they've been thrown out, they've actually been left with insufficient funds to pay for their own care and ill health in their old age, and that's become the real problem of having given away too much too early. So yes, nobody wants to pay too much tax, but actually keep everything in perspective and consider all eventualities and outcomes before you make that big decision.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's where you come to, with these decisions, you come to having a collective of professionals to help you with it. On Mark's point there, you may then also want to have your independent financial advisor helping with that situation, predicting what costs are going to be there in the future. I mean, in terms of the losing control bit, it comes down to trust. It comes down to trust in terms of having them open, honest conversations, being really clear. They sound like a broken record, but it's so important. But there are structures you can use, and one of them is a trust. You could look to pass assets on through a trust where the trustees retain control of those assets. It's an effective way. It's not for every scenario. So there are certain circumstances where you wouldn't do it, but there are certain circumstances where it's definitely a route to consider.
Thank you. And just in going back to the sort of fairness question, I've heard advice in the past also where if a farm or land is left
Have we lost our host?
lost everyone else.
Apologies, we lost you there, Susie. What were you saying?
Yeah, I was saying that you can make provision in your will, for example, that if you leave, if a farm is left to a child or children, but some have been left out, then the ones that have been left the property can simply sell it and thank you very much, go away with the proceeds. But provision can be made for that, you know, if a sale happens within a given time period for the proceeds to be shared in some way, if the donor is concerned that might happen. Is that something that you've seen at all, Sam?
I mean, there's lots of different structures people put in their wills. It depends on the other assets that are available to people at that time. I've seen it before where farms are given, but subject to inheritance tax being paid, or subject to the administrative costs being paid, or subject to a payment being made to siblings upon receipt of the farm. Timeframes given to make those payments. There's lots of different options within their wills for people to do to try and equal it out and make it as fair as they can.
Okay, thank you. Right, we'll go to another question. Joe, I think this is definitely one for you. Are holiday lets, which are part of our diversified agricultural business, are they subject to IHT, and do they not qualify for business property relief from IHT?
Yeah, great question. We've obviously got some changes coming up to furnished holiday lets taking effect next year, and we've obviously got a budget. I don't think we've mentioned the budget yet, but that's coming up in a couple of weeks. So, you know, we don't really know where we're going with a lot of taxes at the moment. But in terms of the holiday lets, normally look at it as it depends on the structure, and it's considered on the whole. You know, if it's part of a wider, bigger farming partnership, for example, and there's another decent acreage being farmed, you can get some relief on it. On the properties if they're part of a bigger bit. But strictly speaking, you know, furnished holiday lets are, what they say on the tin, they are investment properties. So there is likely to be some exposure there. It's about looking at it with the rest of the assets of the farm or the estate, and considering how best to plan if you want to try and mitigate the inheritance tax or the potential inheritance tax charges there. So if you're in a company, for example, then the inheritance tax is assessed on the share value, not necessarily the actual property. So it does completely depend on the circumstances.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Right. This one about land title transfers. So probably just for Sam, but if anybody else wants to chip in, please do. So for inheritance tax purposes, does HMRC, the tax authority, recognise the date agricultural land title transfer applications are received by the land registry, or the date that the land registry completes the application?
It's the date on your transfer forms, your TR1.
Yeah. Okay.
The land registry are taking forever at the moment to register or to change titles. So that would be a bit of a nightmare if it was when they actually processed it. So it is the date. It's like a normal house sale or purchase. Yeah. You complete on a day, you sign your TR1s on that day, that house is yours from that day. The land registry will take a couple of months to catch up with it and give you the deeds that confirm it. But as of the day that you've dated it and sent it in, that is the day that
Thank you.
Counted for your transfer.
Right. Right. We've got another sharing one here, a bit unusual. Ideas, please, about how to share a farm that's been handed down through the generations. There are 3 off-farm sons, and none of us have farmed before. So obviously there are lots of options. they want to know how to share it. So presumably they want to hang on to it. Some ideas for how they could farm it. I can think of a few, but I'm not the expert. You perhaps Mark first of all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Susie. As you say, initial assumption, obviously, is they want to hang on to it. I would probably, my own experience, I would say if you can partition it so that each sibling has direct ownership of their share, that is far easier than giving them joint ownership, because that will, you're essentially just kicking the can down the road by giving them joint ownership. At some point, they're going to have to come to an agreement to split it, and then you've got grandchildren involved as well as children ultimately. So I would say split it 3 ways, get it valued fairly, and then to bring an element of equality and protection to all, because obviously you never know which field might come up trumps for a housing development or a solar scheme at some point in the future, or might strike oil, is to look at some form of overage provision that then flows across the whole of the holding, so that if one person strikes lucky on their share, that the profits from that are then sort of shared equally between the 3 children, if it was 3 children, for example.
Yeah,
that would be my approach.
Yeah. Okay. Joe, do you want to have a word on that one?
Yeah, just picking up on that partition point, there is a capital gains tax relief, but partition relief available as well. So that can be achieved by using that relief in a sort of tax-free manner, or mitigation of capital gains tax. And also, I completely agree with Mark. You're kicking the can down the road if you then got the motor issues of them 4 children, and then trying to then split it further down the line. In terms of running the actual business going forwards, you can get a variety of ways. Contract farming, you could enter into FBT, you could enter into some kind of share farming, although perhaps that's not as appropriate in this situation. But there are ways and means to still have sort of some involvement in the farming side of the operation.
Yeah, thank you. Sam, did you want to join in on that one?
I mean, it would just be to echo what Joe and Mark has said. It depends on the circumstances there as to whether any of the 3 actually has an interest in starting farming, or what they actually want to achieve from it. So if you want to just retain it, as you say, do you want to get contract farmers in which case divide it up, or have your own third of it and you're done? Are there plans for the 3 of you to farm? Are there plans for one of you to farm for the other 2? How is it actually physically going to work? Because partnerships might work. There's lots of different structures that can be put in place for the 3, but it just depends on what they actually want to achieve at the end of it.
Okay, thank you. Right, still on the submitted questions. Joe, does a biodiversity offsetting agreement count as farming? I guess they mean for tax purposes. We manage our grazing to conform to the agreement and use the hay produced in our sheep enterprise. I think it's, jury's still out on this. It hasn't been counted, has it, Joe?
Yeah, from my experience, I think the jury is still out a bit on that one. So, I think there's potentially 2 valuation points there. You've got your agricultural value. Perhaps that Mark and Sam might comment on this as well. We can have an agricultural value, but then there's also going to be a value in excess of that, which might reflect that extra agreement there. And whether that is covered is certainly a question we haven't seen too much tested in tax law in respect of that. So I'm going to sit on the prickly fence with that one, I think, a little bit.
Yeah. Mark, did you want to add anything to that one?
No, I think Joe's absolutely right. On the valuation point, you've got 2 tiers of value there, and I think it's an evolving market, and none of us really know what that top tier is going to be worth. But as you say, they're making as good a fist of it as anyone if they are producing an agricultural crop that is being fed and utilised by their agricultural livestock. And if you were trying to plan ahead for the future to get your ducks in a row. That would be the one way to start doing it, I would have thought.
Yes, they're doing as much as they can at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, and these sort of options are now, coming into the market, and we're talking here about business succession, but they do provide different income streams that can actually assist with the succession planning point. Can you enter into a 30-year agreement where you're going to get a set amount of money, or upfront or over time? Same with solar as well. What's the solar about? That can sort of be earmarked. Go back to the situation where you've got two daughters and a son. Well, could the land for the solar be given? Or the income coming from that be provided to the daughters for the time of the solar lease? There's lots of options there, so it's always worth reassessing these points as these new income streams and new opportunities are presented.
Yeah, thank you. We've got quite a lot of tax questions. I'm just looking for some that that are not going to tie Joe up in every answer. Yeah, another land registry one. So probably for Sam. Is the person's name on the land registry document the sole owner? Or how does a beneficial owner apply to a land registry document?
It depends on the structure in which the land is held. There's two titles to every piece of land. There's the legal title, which is what the land registry hold, and then there's a beneficial title behind it. So the legal owners don't have to be one and the same as the beneficial owners of a property. So trusts are a great example of that. They'll have trustees holding the land, and there will be beneficiaries behind those trustees that actually have the beneficial title to it. Quite often happens in partnerships, where one of the partners will be registered on the land, but they will hold the land for the benefit of the other partners or the partnership. And so, no, not necessarily who is on the land registry title is the person who owns the property. But if it isn't the person on the land registry title that has the sole beneficial interest in that property, then it does now need to be registered with HMRC on their TRS platform to take note of who has the beneficial ownership.
Right, thank you. Right, we have one on, can we give a view on the timelines of Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy tribunals? Mark, probably one for you, this one. I know we haven't got much detail, so I don't know whether this is somebody looking at a tribunal perhaps with a view to succession or some other aspect, but if it's succeeding, we assume it's succeeding to a tenancy because of the subject of the webinar.
Absolutely. No, so he could be, as you say, they could be a succession case, or could be facing a notice to quit following the death of the tenant, perhaps. I think in reality, I don't think there's an easy current answer to the question. So in all of my 30 years of career of dealing with these cases, I've actually never had a succession or notice to quit case go to the Lands Tribunal. So I've got no experience as to how long that's taking. And I think every case I've been involved in has generally been negotiated and settled before we've had to go to the Lands Tribunal. And that, that's always what we would try and manage for our clients if possible. So unfortunately, I can't give you a straight answer.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. This is a bit of a tricky one. I'm going to come to Mark because the obvious answer might be no, but I know Carter Jonas does quite a lot of share farming agreements, Mark, and this is a farm that's not profitable, feasible for a share farming arrangement. I guess that depends who your share farmer is going to be.
Yeah, I think it does. And it could be on, a share farming operation might actually have a considerably lower cost base than the current in-hand farming operation for a variety of reasons that are specific to that individual. So I certainly wouldn't rule it out. And I've certainly seen sort of more common is contract farming than share farming. And I've certainly seen contract farming agreements be considerably more profitable than in-hand farming operations. So there is every prospect, if you could strip out some costs along the way and have an efficient share farmer with the sort of the right labour costs, you could tip the scales in favour of profit somewhere along the line.
Thank you. All right. I'll just go to the inbox, see if we've had questions coming in during this session. All right. This is interesting. If you set up a succession plan and you officially start that plan, sign it over, I don't know whether that means the plan or assets, and then events change, can you undo a plan and start again? Obviously, all of these questions depend on what the circumstances are in each of these cases, but yeah, perhaps go to Sam first, and then Joe, and then Mark.
As you've correctly identified, Susie, it very much depends on what the succession plan was and what the steps were taken to put the succession plan into practice. If you were talking about a partnership or something, adding a sibling or child in as a partner, if the original farmer who owned all the capital in the partnership agreement still has all the capital in their name, then if it turns out that it's not successful having this person in as a partner, then it's a lot easier to remove them as a partner because you've got less money that you need to give them. It's only the share of the partnership profits of that year. It very much depends on what succession planning you did, what succession planning you put into place, as to how easy it is to undo what has already been done and any tax consequences that will arise from it. And that's why, as we keep saying over and over again, communication is key, and understanding what you wanted to achieve in the first place to try and make sure that these mistakes don't happen. I mean, they can happen. And that's why at the very beginning, you want to make sure you have the right structure in place before bringing any younger generations through, to make sure that you don't get into a position whereby you can't undo any succession planning that you started.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I think we've got so many questions. Unless Joe or Mark's got anything burning to say on that one, I'll move to another question. So,
no, all I'd say on that one is, if you're making a gift of something and you execute that gift, you've lost control of the asset.
Yeah.
So just come back to when I said at the start, I think as an intro there, that expectation of time, how long these things take, how long these plans take, they take time for a reason, because you're dealing with valuable assets.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. This is another land registry one, which is coming, I think, Sam, as a result of you talking about them taking a long time. This person has one farm sitting with the land registry for over 5 years. Presumably that's on a transfer. It was 3 titles being brought into one. Should they push to get it finalised or leave them to catch up? 5 years is a long time.
Assumably it's a first registration. They're the ones that tend to take a very long time, unless there's loads of acquisitions being made or something. I mean, by all means, push the land registry and see where you get. They're not the most responsive, but there's no harm in trying to bring it to their attention, pushing it up the list, and seeing whether you get a response. But 5 years is a very long time. I would assume there's been some queries raised by the land registry on it as to why it's taking so long. But whoever you've used as your legal advisor to do it, they should be able to push the land registry to find out what's going on. But yeah, 5 years does seem an incredibly long time. All I can assume is it's a first registration missing or something.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I mean, there's one about, there are a few that mention agricultural property relief and concerns about the budget coming up on the 30th of October as to whether agricultural property relief will be removed. Does the panel have any comments on this? But I mean, I think it's very, obviously we can't speculate. I think most people seem to think something will happen on CGT, whether that's rates or reliefs. What about agricultural property? Joe, you're the obvious one to go to on that one.
Yeah, I think, like I say, we've got this first Labour budget in many years coming up on the 30th. And certainly I do think there's going to be some movement around capital gains tax rates. What that will be, I don't know. I have my own views, but I won't share them on here. I feel we're expecting a tax rate increase there. Agricultural property relief, my gut on it, and this is my personal opinion, it's probably quite an easy area for HMRC to attack in one sense, or the Treasury to attack in one sense, because some people are just, or some landowners are just renting their land under an FBT, or and that attachment to the investment activity is quite clean and clear, but the legislation is pretty complex and it hasn't been changed for a number of years, and that's probably a reason behind that. And I'd be surprised in a way if Labour had managed to sort of implement such changes to such sort of complex legislation in 100 days that they've been in Parliament. So I wonder if it's a bit of flag waving for something that's maybe going to come down the line in the future. In terms of how, sitting here now, what can you do about it? Well, unless we're having a bit of a chat before the starting of the panel here, unless you're sort of in the middle of doing a transaction, or you were going to do a transaction 3 months and in 3 months' time you want to accelerate it, I wouldn't necessarily be venturing into to do anything now for it. I think it's a case of let's see what comes out of the budget, and then there'll be some reaction to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's any appetite to absolutely get rid of APR without giving something alternative to the actual farmers, because the whole reason it's being looked at, as you've said, is the landowners that just rent out their land and get an IHT relief from it. So I don't think it is something, as you say, that they could have. Hopefully they shouldn't touch it in just 100 days, because it is really complicated, and they need to put something in its place to make sure that farmers can carry on operating.
Yeah, and I think on that, it doesn't bring a huge amount of money into the Treasury, but we've got this £22 billion black hole that is talked about, and it looks like Rachel Reeves is probably going to try and fill that with a collection of smaller areas to attack, whether it's APR or capital gains tax. So, but I agree. I think it's an area that hopefully not going to change too much. As well, hopefully, we don't know, but I do think it's an area that's susceptible to change in the future. Labour are now in for a few years. Some would say maybe longer, but I think it will come to a point where it will change. Ever since I've been working in the sector, there's always been, will they change the IHT reliefs, APR, particularly in the budget? It's not happened yet.
No. All right. Got a couple of questions on trusts. Oh, sorry, Mark, did you want to come on that?
I was going to say, looking forward to the future as to where change might come from, I think, the advice I would give any clients is, if you are farming, and the elder generation is at risk, absolutely make sure you've got your structures right and you've got them involved in the business. You're having regular partnership board meetings, and that they're minuted and their attendance is involved and they're part of that decision making process, so that the way it's been described in some of the tax cases is that he was a farmer, he looked like a farmer, he spoke like a farmer, he dressed like a farmer, so that you're ticking those boxes at every stage to build up the evidence trail to make sure you've got the qualification for APR.
Yeah. Okay. And we've had a couple of questions on trusts. One is very straightforward: how does a trust work? But linked to that, in what circumstances would you want to put farming assets into a trust during lifetime? So maybe Sam, then Joe, and Mark, you've probably seen trusts work and perhaps been trustees, on behalf of being a trustee on behalf of a farming family. So perhaps you can comment later on the sort of more practical side of trustees and how to choose them, what they need to do, and Sam and Joe on the sort of legal and tax side.
How does a trust work? I mean, there's lots of different types of trust. The main reason for using a trust is to be able to get the asset away from you, get it out of your estate, but also retain an element of control. So you don't do a straightforward gift. You put it into the trust so that there are trustees that will have the control over the asset, So you haven't gifted it away, and then whoever you've gifted to has gone and got divorced in 2 years' time, and the asset has disappeared, or done something that you didn't want them to do. So the whole idea of gifting assets into trust is to be able to get it out of your estate from an inheritance tax purpose, but retain control of it in some form, although you can't be a beneficiary of it, otherwise it would be a gift for reservation of benefit, it wouldn't work. But it's to retain control whilst giving away the asset. And that's the main reason that people will use trusts. Why would someone put their farm into a trust? It would very much depend on those family circumstances at that time as to why they want to get rid of that asset from their estate, but retain the control still.
Thank you. Joe, did you want to?
Yeah, I agree with Sam there. Yeah, and I'd make the point that trusts can be really simple, but they can also be really complex depending on your approach to them. Certainly, if you're placing assets into or settling assets into a trust, you can get some tax relief. So not necessarily a tax point triggered, but you can get relief for that as well. And on the way out, if you want to then point the assets out of trust. But yeah, what situations do we see them in? It's normally where there's perhaps a lack of confidence in, there's a desire to pass some assets on, but perhaps a lack of confidence in the donor to the donee. So, a classic example is, they're passing on to unmarried children. It's a really classic example, but it does give a bit of control and a bit of protection to the asset value rather than direct gift. So quite commonly used. It seems to be more popular at the moment. Lots of trust work at the moment, particularly in advance of the budget.
Yeah.
You've got to be aware that trusts are taxed at a penal rate. So putting assets that are income producing, etc., into them isn't always the best of ideas. I mean, there are structures around it. You can do double tax returns to get the income back, etc. But there are tax consequences in putting assets into a trust, and you need to get fully advised before you do it to make sure it fits your circumstance.
So, Mark, if you're going to use a trust and you need to choose trustees, and what sort of obligations does that put on the trustee? How does it work practically?
Absolutely, no, exactly, and you're right. I act as trustee for estate clients, and I act as the managing agent for trusts and trustees, so see it from all sides. I think they can be an expensive vehicle to manage in terms of, by the time you then have the legal costs in terms of running them, and if you're having professional trustees, the trustees' fees in administering them. So they can be sort of a more cumbersome vehicle. I think you need to choose your trustees carefully so that they will act with probity and with due regard to protecting and doing the very best for the beneficiary's interests. But equally, you need to know that you're all going to get on and you're relative of one like mind in terms of the direction of travel for the property, the farm or the estate that's in the trust. And I think, probably I would say don't be afraid to change your trustees too after a while, because I think that's where I've seen it go wrong, is that the trustees will almost become embedded and too settled in the role, and it's a given, and their interests and outpoints and views tend to sort of almost look at it as their own. So I think having a rotation and a change is no bad thing.
Thank you. Right, we've got so many questions. This is one where a farm partnership includes 3 partners. One is unmarried, no children. One has 4 children. One of those 4 children works full-time on the farm. The other partner has 2 children, one of which works full-time on the farm. At an initial meeting, this is presumably to discuss succession, should each partner provide copies of their wills to show what their intentions are with the assets of the business? That raises another question about what's a business asset and what's a personal asset, and what are you actually entitled to give away? Because I think there's a lot of confusion between land farmed by the partnership but owned individually and so on. So I'll hand over to perhaps Joe on that one, and then Sam.
Yeah, I'm probably going to give it to Sam first, but
whichever.
But yeah, I think in that, I wouldn't normally expect wills to be sort of just provided straight out. You know, there are they are very private documents. People do share them. You know, where there's great level of transparency, great level of trust. But you know, I wouldn't necessarily expect that to happen. And you're completely right on personal and business assets. You know, it's important those documents are reviewed regularly as well. And typically in a farm, in a farming business, you may also have a farming partnership agreement, which should also be talking.
Should agree with the will.
For the wills, because you always often see that, you know, that's not the case.
Sam?
I mean, I was going to say the partnership agreement is where you should be looking as to what partners are able to do with their partnership share, whether it can be left to outside parties or whether the partnership actually has the choice of being able to buy out that share rather than it being inherited by somebody else. It would normally be the partnership agreement that you'd look to try and control what happens with a partnership asset rather than looking at someone else's will, because the wills contain private information around assets that are nothing to do with the partnership. You can't control what someone does with their own assets. They can change their will after the meeting if they wanted to. So it's kind of a red herring to look at the will in terms of what's going to happen on this partnership, and you're far better off looking at the partnership documents and what's actually available for partners to do, and what everybody is in agreement should happen with partnership shares, whether it should be able to be left to whoever you want and they become a partner in this partnership, or whether the partners can actually purchase the interest and what values they purchase it, etc., etc. But that is all partnership documentation, and that can be agreed between the three partners now.
And the same would apply, you know, as a shareholders agreement for a company. I'm sure that's, you know, so putting that partnership agreement into a corporate environment. You know, equally it's important, and it will dictate what happens.
Probably one from Mark, this one, but please join in, Joe and Sam, if you want to subsequently. If it's become clear that a sale is the only way forward for a family farm, so presumably they haven't got successors or there's an issue with succession, what are the first steps to take to start the process of selling the farm, and what are the average timescales for a farm sale?
Okay. So the first step of the process is obviously get an appraisal of the values of the different elements and the strategy to achieve the best stroke optimal value of the outcome. But I would say to be done alongside that, to really make sure you've exploited every opportunity to maximize value ahead of sale, would be a sort of a planning appraisal, so that, you know, in the current climate, you know, you've looked at all the individual elements, be it farmhouses, cottages, barns, land, and looked at whether there is any potential there for added value or alternative uses. Sort of, you know, solar would be an example in terms of what is the grid connection or grid capacity in that area, for example, so that, you know, you've made sure that you've explored every opportunity to add value or to highlight where value can be created before you go to market. So that would be sort of a key plank of the appraisal that you should obtain. In terms of timescales, I would probably say 3 months to prep it, 3 months in the market to sell it, and then 3 months in terms of the due diligence and the legals, and all of those might move forward or back a month, but, you know, allowing yourself give or take 9 months.
Yeah, right, thank you. Back to the land registry. I think the original questions just prompted a few more. If land's in a partnership, presumably a partnership asset, does this supersede the land registry titles? I think it's a sort of straightforward answer, but Sam.
It doesn't supersede the legal title, as in the legal owner is the only person the land registry will listen to in terms of selling that property.
Yeah.
But in terms of the beneficial ownership, then, as we've said, yes, there's a beneficial title behind it. A lot would once again depend on what's said in the partnership, how the capital has been dealt with within the partnership, as to how the beneficial ownership of that land is actually held. So people can go into partnerships as a legal owner of land and put their capital separate, even though it's in the partnership and they have their own capital account that still has that land in it. Or it can be divided equally between the three parties. It very much depends on what happened in the partnership. But yes, the legal ownership and the beneficial ownership of land can be completely separate and different.
Yeah. Okay. Go sort of farm management and structures question here. So maybe Mark first and then Joe. As a family business, we're thinking of splitting up the farmland and assets so that it's controlled by the two younger members so that they can each operate their own businesses going forward, but sharing some equipment and helping each other. How do you suggest this can be achieved? And also, how should the retiring partners be remunerated in their retirement? Quite a big question, lots to think about there.
Yes, absolutely. I suppose in some respects I was, and Sam and Joe may have more of a clearer steer on the partnership approach, but it's whether actually the retiring partners would stay in the partnership, but it'd be sort of inactive as opposed to active in terms of then continuing to be able to take an income. Because I think in the absence of that, the only way they could continue to take an income would be to retain ownership of some of the land and then to rent the land to the children. I think so. You know, the only sources of income for them will be either partnership or rental income of the land to the next generation. Would be my sort of gut instinct straight off. Sam, Joe, I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of them questions you definitely have to look at in more detail. But basically, it's understanding, you know, what the level of the businesses that are going to be moving forward. What's the requirements for the retiring partners? I mean, do they need cash to come out of the business, or can they use other funds that they may have built up for their retirement? You know, so to suggest how they can get remunerated and the level of remuneration is tricky. Yeah, and then splitting the family business, it's difficult. I think, you know, that you could end up with some kind of joint venture agreement there, perhaps, or a share farming agreement where, you know, depending on circumstances, where people are sharing equipment. It talks about sharing equipment and machinery there, so and helping each other out. You know, share if there's some labour involved. You know, share labour as well. So that might be an option to consider in that situation.
Right, thank you. Sam, did you want to add anything to that?
It was just to echo exactly what they've said. In terms of we need a lot more information.
Yeah.
How are these farming enterprises completely different? Can they continue under one partnership? With the machinery being held by the partners, can it be a share farming agreement? What are the actual circumstances of the retiring partners, etc., to try and work out, is there a better vehicle for this to be able to move forward with, rather than a complete division and move forward from there.
And one business could require a significantly bigger proportion of the assets than the other. So you know, you could end up with how does that move as you go through your succession planning process? You know, and what are you trying to achieve at the end? It's trying to go on, like what I said at the start, that sort of journey. You know, what is that end goal? You know, it might not be that you get to that, and it's probably not going to get to that in a straight line either. You know, but it might be something that takes you on a journey there, and just having that sort of idea of what's required now, but what's also required in 10, 15 years time, 20, 25 years time.
Right, we've got one relates to, we had a question about inheritance tax and use of land for solar and sheep grazing. Similar one here, but a bit more complex. If you have an asset that is, sorry, the question's disappeared. I'll try and find it elsewhere. Bear with me. Here we are. If you have an asset that's farmed, whether arable or livestock, and used for other uses as well, such as solar, wind, storage, burial ground, it sounds like a very diversified business. Is it classified as part of the farm? For example, the area still gets used by sheep as well as for other non-agricultural related uses. And I guess it's one of those long as a piece of string questions. How much is diversified from a tax point of view, and how much is farming? Probably Joe initially.
Yeah. I think is it classified as a farm is a great question. It depends what tax you're looking at generally. So you're looking at capital gains tax, you're looking at inheritance tax. There is that where's your angle coming from? Because they have different. At the moment, they have different sort of levels of trading that you need to try and to achieve to get the tax rates that are perhaps available. But there are ways and means where you can try and ensure that you have a trading position or a wholly trading position, which is probably going to be far more beneficial than having an investment position overall. So it's well worth taking a step back, looking at all the different diversified income streams and the assets that the values and the assets that provide them income streams, and trying to structure that accordingly. It might be that you then siphon something off and divert and stick that somewhere else, trust, company, some other way of taking that approach to give you a more favourable position of what is left. So it's always worth just taking that step back.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Sam on this one. Sam, I know you do tax as well, but we've worked Joe quite hard, so I'll give him a break for a minute, but come in by all means if you want to, Joe. The question is, if you want to diversify into things like short-term holiday lets, does it make sense to run this type of activity under a separate limited company from a succession point of view?
Very much depends on the farm that you've got. So if you are diversifying and putting in a holiday let, but you've already got a very profitable farm, then you would hopefully get business property relief on the wholly and mainly test on that holiday let. Therefore, taking it out means that you're going to make it a taxable asset because your limited company is going to have non-trading assets in it only. But it needs to be looked at in the whole. If you've diversified and given yourself lots of holiday lets that massively overtake any agricultural action or any business action that's going on in there, you're going to fail the wholly and mainly, and then you're going to lose the business property relief on other assets like your farm machinery, your live and dead stock, etc. So it's a balancing act to make sure that what you've put in terms of your holiday let is not going to overtake what you do in terms of your farming activity, which would therefore make you lose business property relief completely. But if it is actually your farming is still your main business and you are wholly and mainly still acting as a business and this is just a side, then you're absolutely fine. That needs to be watched though, because that's another one that is being looked at. The current test is 50% or more, or 51%, so more than 50% on the wholly and mainly. It's a really favourable test currently. And they are looking at whether that is a little bit too favourable and whether or not they should reduce that percentage down. Currently, really favourable test as long as you can show that you are trading wholly, mainly, so over 51%, then you can keep these holiday lets in. Okay. But it needs to be looked at in the whole. You need to have a proper meeting with your accountant, with your lawyer, with your manager. Everybody needs to be there to look at this as a full picture as to where your income is coming from, what activities are being carried out on the farm, how much have you diversified, is it still going to get the wholly and mainly? If not, then yes, potentially putting it into a separate company is the way forward so that you don't jeopardize your business property relief on other assets.
Okay. Joe, I hope we don't feel you've trodden on your toes there, but
I think that was a great answer by Sam, to be honest. I probably couldn't add too much more than that. She nailed that one.
Well, I've got another one for you anyway, so here we go. So we currently trade as a limited company and the land and houses are held as personal assets. Should we form a partnership or limited liability partnership, and which generation should hold the shares? We have a small amount of land that may have hope value and 4 sons, one of which lives on the farm, another lives and works there. So I'm not clear then whether 2 sons work on the farm or not, but one certainly does.
Yeah, I mean, lots going on there to consider. Really. I mean, in terms of converting from a partnership into a company, I think that was part of the question there.
They're currently a company. Should they form a partnership or a limited liability partnership?
I mean, exiting a company's not the most straightforward thing in the world. You know, so that can have some consequences. It can be done. Obviously, you can do that, and there's nothing stopping you from going to a partnership. And then, you know, how do you then deal with the control element? Well, if you're in a company, you know, the owners have shares, you know, but there are also directors that control and operate the company, or operate companies, or rather control the company. In a partnership, that is different, and it would depend on what you're sort of looking to achieve there as the most desirable outcome. I think it's a tough question to answer in a couple of minutes, probably.
Yeah.
Without trying to duck out of it, but I'll try and come back on that one in more detail.
Mark, I'll come to you on this one. Tricky family farming situation, and you know, it was mentioned that things can get difficult sometimes. So this situation is where I presume the parents want to split a family farm between 3 children. One works on the farm, one's not interested, and the third one says they're interested but doesn't help, but is trying to push the parents into making succession decisions. You must have come across all sorts of situations where the family dynamics aren't what we might want them to be, or hope they would be. So Mark, we've just got only 4 minutes left, so I'm just going to finish with Mark on this one and then thank everybody. So over to you, Mark, now.
No, thanks, Susie. Yes, no, that does sound like a tricky situation, and I think it's if I was involved, it would be really sort of standing firm with the parents as to what they think is the right thing to do for each of their 3 siblings, and certainly not to be put under any undue pressure from one or the other. And whether, you know, and I mentioned right at the outset that phrase, the honest broker, as it were, is whether, you know, if I was in that role as land agent working with that family, whether, you know, it was possible to have a sort of around the kitchen table meeting where, you know, you could act as honest broker and really explain to all of them, you know, the way forward and how you could help that dialogue and conversation, whilst, you know, probably looking to protect the parents' interests so that they can feel that they've done the right thing by all 3 children, whatever the right thing would be in their opinion.
Okay, Sam or Joe, anything to add on that one while I just watch the time?
Probably not for myself, no.
Okay, thank you. Right, so well, we have covered quite a lot of questions. I'm just wondering whether we can get one more in. I just wanted to mention we have had some quite long questions and quite complex ones, which I've tended to avoid, and I will try to cover some of them with business clinic questions over the next couple of months to any one of the 3, you know, whichever of the 3 sponsor firms seems most appropriate. But please do keep sending questions into Business Clinic. We try and get you some expert advice free if we can. And just
there was a great question there I saw earlier, Susie.
Yeah.
Just said, and someone had asked about what help can they get. You're entering into your succession plan. You're entering into quite complex and difficult conversations, and you know, ask. I think the point I say is, you know, ask for some help. You know, if it's a family friend or if it's a professional that, you know, you all know and you all trust, you've got to maybe try and find that person. So there are people around who will help. There are people who do specialise in mediation if you need to go to that point, and succession plans are quite a key issue. So do ask. Don't sit on your hands and say nothing, because that won't help the situation.
And someone's also asking if their question can be answered. We have run out of time, but we will get answers to some of them for you by another means. We've got your email addresses, and we'll try and deal with some of the others. So very briefly, thank you everybody for watching. I hope it has been useful. I think there's been a lot to work on there, a lot of very varied questions. Obviously the budget's coming up, and fingers crossed that farming gets a fair wind in that. Thank you, Mark, Joe and Sam, for your time and your expertise. I'm sure it's been valuable. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
And thanks everybody for watching. Do look out for the recording. You'll get an email to tell you when that's ready.